Can everyone see the screen? Okay. Excellent. So we are going, this is Broker Series Week 3, number 3 in this series, 3 of 4. Today we'll be covering BRBC, TDS, SPQ, and AVID. What does that mean? That's the Buyer Compensation Agreement, Buyer-Broker Agreement. It is the Transfer Disclosure Statement, which is required seller disclosure in the state of California. SPQ, which is the Seller Property Questionnaire, which is a form that CAR made. Some of it is federally required questions, but some of it is just extra questions that we deemed should be disclosed. And then the agent visual inspection disclosure, which is a required disclosure. So welcome everyone. We're going to start with the BRBC date prepared. That date does not, can everyone see the screen? We're good? Okay, yeah. That date is just nothing important. It's just the date prepared so we can reference it. Obviously you put the buyer U. So this is, buyer 1. And you would be Keller Williams Realty, right? Does it make sense? Or wherever you are. So not your name, but Keller Williams Realty. This buyer-broker agreement must be completed before you do any substantial real estate activities with a buyer, including showing homes and things like that. So representation period is not to exceed 3 months. FYI. If you do a representation period that exceeds 3 months, it is automatically a void agreement and you do not have a valid buyer-broker agreement with your buyer. Now, there is one exception, and this section is for commercial. They try to do it for commercial, but they just wrote it as if the buyer is a corporation, LLC, partnership, that you can then write longer than 3 months. But it has to be an entity, not a trust, but a corporate entity, corporation, LLC, or partnership. We all good on that? We're good? All right. Everyone's all quiet on this one. So, non-exclusive, the A2, 4B here is non-exclusive or exclusive. I always recommend you do exclusive. Exclusive would mean that they have to work with you only. If you do non-exclusive, then they do not have to work with you only. If they use another agent and they find a house and write the offer, you are out the commission. So I would write that exclusivity and explain it to them. I love your emoji, Jen. Let's go to 2B, property to be acquired. Now, you have to think of this section as something that restricts the scope of your buyer-broker agreement. Okay, so when you sign a buyer-broker agreement, you are saying, I'm going to represent you as a real estate agent for the next 3 months, and I'm going to essentially it defaults to single-family resident. I'm going to be anywhere in California. You have to use me if you're going to buy a single-family home. So in B1, if you want to extend that or condo or manufactured home, if you want to extend that to multifamily 2 to 4 units, 5 or more units, industrial, vacant land, commercial, tenancy in common, or only a specific property, you will put those there. But if you check any of these boxes, you are expanding the scope of your BRBC from single-family homes, condos, and manufactured homes to other types of real estate. Make sense? And just FYI, if you are checking anything that is considered a commercial, which is 5 or more units, industrial, commercial, vacant land that is for commercial use, then we have a prohibition in the brokerage against doing commercial transactions. You have to either refer it to a commercial agent or get a commercial agent to agree to code the transaction with you. So please note that. If you put any specific properties, you are then restricting your scope of your BRBC to those properties only, even if there's other things checked. So please be aware, this B1 can help you expand the scope of your buyer broker agreement, but this last checkbox, the following properties, will restrict it, the scope of the things. Also B2, location. This will also restrict your scope of your BRBC. So think about your BRBC. I got 3 months restriction. B1 makes it only single family homes, or I can expand that. B2 location says it goes from I have jurisdiction over all of California. If you put counties or cities, it's going to restrict that from California down to those counties or cities that you put in there. So additional description, if you have any other restrictions, you put those in there in B3, that's what those will go for additional restrictions on what this buyer broker agreement will be represented. So just FYI, I've had clients that'd be like, not myself, but I've dealt with broker issues where they just sign the agreement, single family, and then lo and behold, the buyer goes and looks at a duplex and wants to buy the duplex, live on one side and rent out the other, and they do that. And this wasn't checked. Technically, there was no buyer broker agreement for a multi-unit property. They did not have a buyer broker agreement for that property. Does that make sense? So I've had instances where they put in counties, and these are the counties that the buyer identified they wanted to work in. And then the buyer ends up buying a home not in that county, and they were out of commission on that. So please, I know some of you are like doing the conversation with your buyers, and they say, I want to look in Sacramento and Stanislaus counties, and you put those in there. Just know you are severely restricting the scope of your BRBC. So now it's good to note those so that you know what to send them. You don't necessarily need to put that in your BRBC as it will restrict the scope of your BRBC. But if they say, but don't worry about Stanislaus County, I have an agent, I'm working in Stanislaus County, I only want you for Sacramento County, that would be an instance where I would put Sacramento County only in there. I hope that, any questions on that? So
Yeah, John, so do you recommend to just leave it blank?
I recommend to leave it blank from the agent perspective. Does it make sense? And I
Oh,
would make the buyer want to restrict that, right? So
okay. Okay, thank you.
because I've had it where we've seen it where there's buyers, and I've seen it where it's like I'm either going to buy in Sacramento or I'm going to buy in in Merced, right? So like very wide, right? So I wouldn't recommend restricting unless the buyer is really asking you to restrict the scope of the BRBC. So
Okay, thank you.
on C here, uh, 2BC. Additional buyer preferences, if you check that box, it will add a bit form, which will put restrictions in there, has a form that has all their stuff. I would be now the bit form is good as a questionnaire of what you want to ask them. I would be hesitant to put that in there because it could be construed as, even though it doesn't say it could be construed as restricting your buyer broker agreement with that buyer. So properties excluded from representation. So if the buyer has previously, say, have fiduciary has a procuring cause issue with another agent, maybe they have fired their current agent and moving to you as an agent and sign a new buyer broker agreement. But just so you know, if a previous agent has showed them certain properties, that previous agent may have a procuring cause issue they may be entitled to the commission if you were to write an offer on one of the previous shown properties by the other agent. So this would be an instance of where you're going to have that sort of issue. You would list those properties. And if you're going to um, try to show the property again and take away the procuring cause for the buyer, please contact me as your broker. We will need to talk about what you would need to do to have a preponderance of evidence that you were the procuring cause agent of that offer. So, and we would have to work on that. So, D7. Any questions on the B section? So we're talking about expanding the scope beyond single family and also restricting the scope with specific property information, property addresses, or counties or cities. So now we're getting to the meat and potatoes. So buyer compensation notice. This is the amount of compensation. And I recommend you put 3, and this is the reason. If you put anything less and you get more when you write your offer, we will have to be forced to restrict your commission down to whatever is on the buyer broker agreement. So I recommend you start high and reduce it if you need to. Now, maybe some buyers are reluctant to do that. I would then work on your presentation. We have not had a buyer disagree with that if you do your presentation correctly. So, but I recommend 3%. Of course, you can do less. And there's this clause E2-4G, which is important. And this is what you need to explain to your buyer. If the broker receives compensation from sellers or others for broker's rotation buyer, that amount shall be credited against the buyer's obligation. And then you'll see here, broker shall not receive any amount in excess of the amount specified. So that's where it restricts you. Okay. Now let's talk about everyone clear on compensation. Continuation right to payment broker involved properties. If you put a calendar days in here, if you leave it blank, it's not appropriate. It's not applicable. It's void. It's removed from the contract. But if you put a day, like 90 days from this period, continuation period, this says after the 90 days or the 3 months of your broker agreement, if on day 95 they use another agent, but they show a property or they write an offer on a property that you showed, you will be owed compensation, is what that says. But you have to have days in there. And you have to provide a list of homes, properties to the buyer prior to the expiration or cancellation of the BRBC. Makes sense? So for this clause to be active, you must have a days listed in there at the time of BRB signing, and prior to cancellation or expiration of the BRBC, you must provide the buyer a list of properties that you were involved with, shown them, or offered on, for this to be a valid claim against further compensation after the expiration of the BRBC.
John, how many days can we go out? How far can we go out? Can we go 180?
You can go 180. I wouldn't recommend that sort of practice. I wouldn't recommend going beyond 180, just out of common practice. If you do anything egregious, I've seen courts and even DRE say that's unreasonable, right? So you got to keep it reasonable. But the longest I've seen is 180 days, and I think that's reasonable, right? So,
Okay.
Cancellation rights and notice, and I want you to understand this. Non-exclusive, cancel upon receipt. So this box check up here, if you don't check that box up in 2A to make it, if it's still non-exclusive, the buyer can cancel immediately by texting you a text or emailing you. It is immediately canceled. Okay. If it is checked exclusive, they can cancel, but they have to do it. They have to give you 30-day notice. Okay. So you have a little bit of a negotiation ability if you check exclusivity, which I recommend.
What about that box 16 on that one page that has to be signed by them? I noticed on DocuSign, it has the initials there, but they can bypass that.
Which one?
Unless you hard do it, the box 16 for that shows they have to initial there for it to be considered exclusive.
Box 16.
Yeah.
It's box 15.
There's a spot.
It's box 15.
Yeah, they have to initial here. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so there's a spot. Yeah.
Yeah,
So there's a spot like
yeah.
DocuSign. It allows them to bypass it. I have to manually go in and hard code it now for them to make
Yes,
sure that they
I had
talk
that
about that.
problem too.
If you go straight from car forms and connect your DocuSign and you do it through that system, that means you don't log into DocuSign separately, you just send it through DocuSign. Any initial that is optional will end up optional on the DocuSign, which is this one. And also on the RPA, the mediation arbitration is considered optional, so the buyers can skip it. So just know, both on the RPA and this form, if you're going to do this 15, you're doing exclusive, you need to go in and you can just click on it and it'll say optional at the top, and you can toggle it to be required. Make sense? So questions? I'll go back, but thank you. But yes, that must be initialed for you to, so the buyer is properly noticed on what exclusivity means. So, okay. Time to deliver buyer personal information. This is 5 days. This is really to help you make sure that your buyers get that they understand they need to get financial information to the lender generally to make this happen. Okay, now this is the linchpin here, G2. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay the broker. So I imagine a lot of times you're going to be checking this box. They're saying, John, I'm happy to use you, but I don't want to pay you a commission. If the seller doesn't pay, I don't want to do it. So you would have to check this box. Buyer's obligation to transact is contingent upon the seller's agreement to pay the amount of compensation. So this is saying I have to get it from the seller. If there's anything that is above that the buyer has to either approve it or they can cancel the BRBC. So, for example, if you have 3 in there and you get a 2.5 compensation, you need to do a modification of terms BA, buyer agreement, and you need to change it for that property down to 2.5, so this provision will not kick in. Clear as mud? So here's where you put other terms. I imagine you wouldn't put other terms in, but buyer initials, broker initials. If you do not sign it, it is not a valid agreement. There should be no additional advisories you should put on there, I don't imagine, so just be careful. All these, if you look on this, every one of these check boxes will correspond to a paragraph. So E1 talking about compensation will be 4B. So if you look at 4B, it'll talk about broker right to compensation. So just know if you have confusion on what any of these boxes do, just look at that provision and it will toggle you to the appropriate paragraph so you can read about what it is. Obviously, I highly recommend that you read all the forms. If you read the forms, they actually do make a lot of sense and you can have a lot better representation of your clients. So initials on here, on page 2, initials again on page 3, initials again on page 4. By the way, this is saying they are doing mediation arbitration if you were to be in dispute with your buyer. An exclusivity clause, as Marissa mentioned, 15, they must initial this if you are asking them to be exclusive. So, and as she noted, if you do it directly from car forms or zip forms into your DocuSign, if it is an optional thing for the buyer, it will end up an optional box in the DocuSign, and you have to go in and manually change that to required. Entity buyers, if they're a corporation, a trust, an LLC, probate, partnership, power of attorney, any of those things, they're entity buyers. You would check that box. You would type the entity name, Barnato Family Trust. Does that make sense? And you would put the authorized signers, Jonathan Barnato. Does it make sense? And you would put those in there. They would sign as Jonathan Barnato, and then I would put title trustee. Does that make sense? So actually, it should be Barnato. So, and the buyer is Barnato Family Trust. So does that make sense? So if they're buying it, your signatures are here. If you want to have more than 2 agents, you put your agent information. You can have 2 agents here. If you do 2 agents here, you won't have to do an AAA form later. So. Well, actually, if you do, you still have to do AA, but you have to check that box. I'll add AA. Any questions? If you're checking the box for 2 different companies, that is not allowed in our brokerage. Please refrain from doing that. That is the BRBC. Please note, it is very hard to enforce a BRBC. So you can't go to the association and things like that. It is basically a mediation, arbitration, small claims court claim if you want to challenge a buyer with the BRBC compensation schedule. So please be attentive. Don't use the BRBC as a hammer. Try to get the relationship with them where they want to honor that BRBC. So, okay. Any questions on that? That's advisory. Don't worry, they just sign on that. Possible representation of more than one buyer. I do want to talk about dual agency real quick because I tried to talk about it multiple times. But if you're doing dual agency, meaning you got the listing and the buyer, just note you can't let the seller, you can't tell the buyer or either party's negotiation position other than the seller's list price or the buyer's offer price. So you can't tell the seller, hey, the buyer is willing to go above this, just counter them. And you can't tell the buyer, hey, just come in less than list price, I'll get the seller there. That is illegal. That would be a violation of dual agency. And dual agency is the number one way agents get sued.
Hi, can you repeat that, John? What did you say?
So when you're doing a dual agency transaction, and it says here, a dual agent may not, without the express permission of the respective party, disclose to the other party confidential information, including, but not limited to, facts relating to either the buyer or seller's financial position, motivations, bargaining position, or other percentage that may impact the price, including the seller's willingness to accept a price less than the list price or the buyer's willingness to pay a price greater than the price offered.
Got
So
it.
if you say I have a listing and I get a buyer and they're signing the BRBC and they're going to say this and you're going to be a dual agent, and you say, don't worry, I can get the seller down on price, you have violated your fiduciary duty to the seller. And the buyers go like, John, I understand, but if you sell them, or I can get your offer accepted over the other offers, even if it's less, you have violated your fiduciary duty to the seller. If you say, and then the buyers go and the buyers say, like, we're going to offer, let's say the house is 500, we're going to offer 475. You're like, great, we offer, but we'll go to 500 if needed to get the house. If you go to the sellers and say, hey, can't counter at list price, they'll come up. That is a violation of fiduciary to the buyers. So just be very careful. And actually, about always every year, between 60 and 70% of lawsuits against real estate agents involve dual agency transactions. So you have to be very careful about that. So I always try to point that out, especially if you're signing a BRBC with a buyer who wants to offer on your listing, right? So there you go. Any questions on that?